Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Always Adapting, Always Exhausted. Can we ask if anyone on the call is feeling this way at times? This is about the hidden cost of constant change. I'm Allison DeFlorio, and I am so honored to have with us our go-to expert for all things mental health and well-being. And whenever we just need a dose of some feel good, Karla Chin, who is the Chief Wellbeing Officer at our sister company, Exude Benefits. Welcome, Karla.
Thank you for having me. Excited to have this conversation.
Karla, May, as you know, is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I think that you and I have probably presented a webinar around a whole host of topics in this space over the last several years. And when we were planning for today's presentation, we were talking about our clients and the experiences that they have been dealing with over the last year, over the last 6 months, and the common theme that kept coming up is this ask for, it's just, when does it stop? When does the change stop? And the answer is it doesn't stop, but how can we equip our leaders and our employees with tools and resources to help them navigate this constant change? So, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have been with Exude before and are familiar with us, welcome back. This session is being recorded, and we will send out a link post session. Your phones are muted, but your questions are important. So Karla and I will be monitoring the chat, so please feel free to drop your questions in, and we'll do our best to address those questions over the course of the session. I'd like to take just a moment and introduce our respective companies and give you some context for today's session, if I may. Uh, the work that we do in Exude Human Capital is in the areas of human resources, inclusion, equity, and leadership development. And when I think about the topic today, we're going to be focusing on what we have heard from our clients and how we have helped our clients structure policies and job architecture and roles and responsibilities and help to develop leaders to be able to be effective in inclusive leadership during times of change and in just regular times to really help alleviate some of the pressures and stressors that our employers feel. We work with employers in both the for-profit and nonprofit space, and I hope to share some examples of what we've seen working really well in the workplace today. And I'll turn it over to Karla.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you again, Allison, for having me here today to, embark on this really important topic. As Allison mentioned, I work at Exude Benefits, sister company of Exude HC. I've been with Exude Benefits for over a decade now, and I started our total well-being practice. So as Chief Wellbeing Officer, I have a very meaningful job, at least through my lens and sort of aligning with my own purpose and passions. I get to go into organizations and consult, deliver, facilitate trainings and coaching services, all with the focus of how do we rehumanize the workplace? How do we support the well-being of workers today, especially in what I'll say the VUCA environment? And we're going to get into that. So a little teaser of what that is. And it really aligns to this whole change and uncertainty that we're experiencing. So the approach is really multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and you'll see that spread throughout, that this isn't just about what EAP is going to be best for you to deliver. We want to get to the systemic root cause of what's impacting worker well-being and mental health challenges today. And so I hope that that's what you're expecting and that you're ready to learn with us.
Great. Thank you, Karla. So we're going to first talk a little bit about what's impacting organizational, societal, continuous change and how that really is contributing to some stressors for our employees in the workplace. And very importantly, we're going to identify some of those stressors with a focus on the things that you can control, but with an awareness on the things that exist and we have to acknowledge. And and then very importantly, as Karla alluded to, is what are some actionable strategies that you can deploy or introduce to support employee well-being, and really in creating that psychologically safe space. And Karla's going to get into the brain science behind that and how psychological safety during times of constant change can really be a differentiator in how somebody is able to function, show up, perform in the workplace. We always like to create a little bit of context, and I don't think that anything we're about to share with you is going to be surprising, but it is a bit uh, daunting. And Karla spoke about, and as we were planning for this, she kept bringing up VUCA, which you probably remember is a military term that was used many, many years ago, and we're starting to hear it used again because of the current situation. Karla, do you want to walk everybody through kind of how we're thinking about VUCA?
So when we think about VUCA, and you can see here on the screen, right, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think what's probably going to help us digest this in a more impactful way is to pause and reflect and think about each of the components of VUCA and assess, like, have you experienced some volatility, right, recently? Maybe the last week has felt pretty volatile, or the last quarter. Uncertainty, right? Maybe we could check the box on that. Complexity in the role that you're in, right? And even outside of the workplace. And ambiguity, not really knowing what's going to come next, or what, you're going to be dealing with in the future. So, it's very simple terms, but so relatable. And if we can see in the chat, like, if one, you're familiar with the term VUCA and maybe using this language with your teams to make sense of some of our experiences. And if not, which should the components of VUCA may be showing up more prominently for you today, and just, what you're going through in your role. So hopefully we can get some chat engagement in there. But one thing I will mention why we decided to include VUCA, it's sense making, right? We're all living in a VUCA world, right? And some of us may be feeling components of VUCA more strongly than others, and maybe it's all equal. But when we have language to describe what we're experiencing, it does help to tame the brain a little bit. It doesn't, eradicate the experience of VUCA, but our brain can at least make sense of, right, this is what we're living through. And so it's a term that we also want to leave you with in case you want to use this with your teams to make the sense making more real. So let's see what's happening in the chat. Not familiar. Yeah, I think Tamika, yeah, absolutely, right? I think it's something that we've are all living through. And if think about COVID too, right? I mean, that we could easily use this and framed it for that.
I think it's interesting too, because it really reflects both what's happening within our organizations, because organizations have been forced to change and adjust, and then what's happening externally that is outside of our control, but that is really impacting all of us, leaders, employees, before you even walk in the door or show up on your screen for a meeting. So how is it showing up? And these are some recent stats from 2025 surveys of US employees, that how it's showing up. They're reporting 66% of US employees are reporting experiencing burnout at an all-time high. That's a really high number, 66%. And I can just say anecdotally, I feel like, and Karla, maybe you do too, when we're talking with clients, we're hearing this on a regular basis. And we're hearing it at all levels of an organization. 45% of those reporting burnout are actively looking for a job elsewhere. Mind you, that could also be on your company dime, because and how does that impact productivity in your area? But when people feel that level of burnout, they're looking to run away from something. They're looking to seek a greener pasture somewhere. 61% report that they believe they will be leaving their current roles within 1 year. It's at that level. And then lastly, is 70% report anxiety due to the constant change. We know that most humans, most adults, do not generally love change. It's probably, a third can accept it, manage it. They're wired to be potentially a little bit more resilient to change. A third struggle, a third really have a difficult time. And that, increases somebody's desire to be able to leave or exit or seek another job. You layer on top of that, this to me, startling statistic, almost 40% of leaders would rather quit than lead another change. I can share with you, and I can think of a handful of clients that we're working with right now who are whose leaders are managing not one, not two, but three or more massive change initiatives throughout their organization. And that requires, it's difficult for the leaders, and the leaders are the ones that have to set the tone for helping others navigate through change. So when you look at that number, almost 40%, that to me is pretty astounding. Close to 80% of workers experience more change over the past year, and that's impacting their job satisfaction. So we have seen a decline in job satisfaction over the years, and we know that given all the change that we're experiencing, that's going to continue. And then we'll come back to that psychological safety that we spoke about the opening. Psychological safety can reduce that change fatigue because that's what we're talking about, always exhausted. It's the actual fatigue that change creates. And I know, Karla, you have done a lot of work in this space and have a lot to share around psychological safety.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not a one conversation or an one day intervention approach. I think that's really the challenge with psych safety is that the feeling of psych safety within a team can change just from one individual leaving a team or a new member, being added to the team or just a challenge within two team members, right? So we're dealing with humans and we're complex beings. And I think that the resilience needed and agility to sustain psychological safety is a requirement as well. So just as a caveat that there is no sort of cheat sheet, like here's how you do it step by step. It is the willingness to lean in, and self-awareness is a big part of that too. So we will get into that a little bit more in the further slides.
Great.
All right. So as Allison mentioned, and I'm sure we can, most of us at least can raise our hands here and say that we don't like change, right? I certainly don't like change. I like change that I want to experience. So when just as an example, and someone asked me the other day, like, I'm Canadian. I grew up in Toronto. I moved here in 2007. So when folks find out that, I'm Canadian and I'm living here, like, why did you move or what led you to move? And, I was engaged to my husband. We had a long distance relationship. And one of us, we had to make a decision who's going to move. And I actually like new experiences. Like I'm your adventure seeker, although it doesn't seem like it at times. I am one to try new things, and a major life change like moving to a different country was exciting to me. That might have freaked someone else out, right? That might have been like no hard stop, not worth the relationship. For me, it was. There's change that we don't invite, and there's change that can activate and threaten us based on lived experiences, right? So the VUCA environment, so in the context of what we're talking about today, right, brain doesn't like that. Our brains want certainty. It wants to know that I can predict my environment because that means I will be safe and that I will stay alive. Right? The brain's primary goal is to keep us alive. And so with that context in mind, put ourselves now in this environment where we're living in a VUCA world and there's constant uncertainty, volatility, ambiguity, right? It's like, where's the map? What's the GPS coordinates? I don't know. It's changing tomorrow or maybe in the next hour. That's a lot of cognitive load on our brain, taxing, right? And so the brain only has so much, it's not an infinite amount of energy. And so what it does is it tries to reserve by creating predictability in our environment. So when there's something like even a new habit, as an example, if you're trying a new habit, you're trying to develop something new, that you're trying to change what you're doing, it's hard in the beginning, right? It's like your brain's like, wait, I got to focus a lot on that because it's not something I'm comfortable with. And then you start getting better at it, like driving for the first time, hyper vigilant, focus. And then you're hypno driving the next month. They're like, okay, I got this. It's in my memory center. I got to figure it out. It's the same thing with change. The only thing is what we're experiencing is not situational in that here's the change, and then we can go back to sort of our your thermostat temp of what we're used to. It's relentless at times. And so we're not designed as humans to have this amount of change constantly. When we're hunter-gatherers, we have that heightened stress when we're hunting for food. Our life is in danger. We might be eaten alive. And then we go back to our camps and tribes, and then we can relax and go back to, homeostasis and be able to feel safe. So I think this is really important to understand in neuroscience of why we resist it and why anxiety is also on the rise, right? We'll talk about some risk factors in a moment. But I just want to normalize that if you are feeling overwhelmed and a heightened sense of anxiety and feeling maybe even disassociation as a symptom, meaning checked out, some numbing, maybe you're finding yourself procrastinating a little bit. Those are all human behaviors, coping reactions to stress, anxiety, and really because of uncertainty.
And that's an important piece for managers to be aware of. So some managers may not be aware that an employee is exhibiting those types of behaviors,
Mhm.
maybe not showing up on camera on a call, maybe being late with deliverables when they're not, in the past, typically haven't been late with deliverables. These could be signs or symptoms that the anxiety or the stress or the ambiguity is a little bit too much for that person at that time, and we have to take some sort of intervention to help gain clarity.
Yeah, and just to one point, you can stay on the slide, Allison, and I just wanted to make sure I emphasize the ability to think and perform, right? That last point is important. I don't know, Allison, you can give examples too, but I know that I've had many conversations with managers who have been so hard on themselves because they feel like they're just unable to keep up with the volume of, different role or different functions or projects that they have in place. And are feeling like they're just failing at everything, right? And I'm sure really every worker can have that experience. But when we're in an environment where we're constantly trying to navigate the gray and the unknown, that's a pretty unrealistic expectation to put on ourselves that we're going to be high performing constantly, right? In those environments, especially if our environment isn't designed in a way to support us while living in a VUCA world.
Yeah, and I think you said something earlier also, back in hunter-gatherer days, you used to be able to retreat, at least at the end of the day, and feel that there was some safety, some consistency. But when the external world, the societal world, is going through this same sort of VUCA experience, and there's not as much certainty there, you don't give that brain the time to rest and recuperate, to be able to come back and think and perform at perhaps the way that they had in the past.
Right. And that saber-toothed tiger example, when we're hunter-gatherers, that same physiological response that our body goes through from stress and feeling like we have to survive in that moment and fight or flight, that can be triggered by an email today. That's our modern day saber-toothed tiger. That can happen from feeling dismissed, rejected, overlooked. It can have a difficult conversation that you might have had, feedback that you were given. So, like, there are saber-toothed tigers existing in our environment today in these forms because that's actually our brain doesn't really think that it's a saber-toothed tiger. That's where it just knows the feeling is I'm in threat and I may not survive. So I'm going to change my biochemicals, or everything. I'm going to get ready to either fight, freeze, faint, right? Like, so it's like play dead and act like I'm good so that they can go away into threat, right? And so that's why we procrastinate. That's why we avoid, because that's actually a human response to threat.
Yeah, I'm curious how many people listening have had that experience, that
Yeah.
Monday morning email or the Friday afternoon at 4:45 email that you weren't expecting that totally uproots a project that you're working on or some belief or direction that you believe to be true, and all of a sudden you're hearing this. And I think about it too in these times where there is so much change happening so quickly. Even the best communicators struggle with making sure that everyone who needs to know an update knows an update. And I think that creates a little bit more anxiety and perhaps can impact that psychological safety when people aren't getting the information that they need to be updated on change as the information is revealed.
Right. And so this slide just shows, the interplay and connection between psychological safety, which is when we think about a team feeling safe to fail, to make mistakes, to be vulnerable within a team, right? Not be viewed as ineffective, still have my status within the tribe, right? We're thinking about our brain's still wired the same way when we're hunter-gatherers. So that need for belonging is like a human core need of survival. When we were ostracized, if we were ever ostracized from a tribe, when we're hunter-gatherers, it would lead to death.
Hmm.
We're not equipped to survive on our own, right? Based on how, our society was back then. Today, being, dismissed or not included or not feeling safe, being able to speak up within a team or share that I'm actually struggling right now. I've been having these lived experiences. I'm behind on my goals and objectives. That could feel like the same threat in our brain of what will happen if, they find out and I'm no longer part or viewed as effective or competent. Same kind of pain in the brain, right? And fear gets activated. So this is why psychological safety and ensuring that teams and leaders, can really activate this, that when someone messes up or fails or is struggling, that we keep the human part of the team, right? Especially when we know it's extra challenging to operate and function in our current environment. Accountability, 100% still needs to be there, right? So again, I think there's a balance. But how it relates to psychological health, we see that correlation, and even the data that Alton showed, right? Like we're hear it all the time. Like folks would leave their jobs often because of their managers or because they don't feel supported, right? It's not usually just because of a workload issue. It's often, people will give more of themselves if they feel valued, right? And again, we shouldn't take advantage of that, but I think it's important to emphasize. On the bottom here, you'll see the two most common mental health challenges are depression and anxiety. They can frequently co-occur, so it's not like it's just having a lived experience of one. But the common risk factors, which is important to highlight, is distressing and uncontrollable events. Tie that into the VUCA, right? And an ongoing stress and anxiety. So there's that like inability to recover, that time to just recharge, to restore, right? It's like on. So low and moderate level anxiety is actually more harmful than those like extreme peaks of situational stress that then allows you to recover. It's the wear and tear of like, our cognitive mental health. It sometimes feels like our spirit and soul gets like worn and torn along the way as well, right? And so that's really the concern, even from a clinical side, and how that can lead to, health issues.
It just made me think of something too, somewhat related. But one of the stats that I had shared about the level of burnout, if you broke that down to age groups, some of the highest level of burnout that we're seeing is that the 18 to 24 and the 25 to 34 age group, which I think is really interesting. And I think people come obviously people they say 1 in 4 people will experience depression or anxiety at some point in their life, but their baseline coming into it, we know that might be a higher baseline just based on COVID and the impact of the recent years. So that thinking about everybody coming into your workplace from a different baseline. They may be able to, I mean, in their own experiences, have been able to navigate change or been exposed to change or experience change differently than other people. So not everybody's going to experience it the same way.
Absolutely.
So, you know, we know that this situation exists, but we want to talk a bit about so what? What can you do? What can the people on this call do to help themselves and their organizations and those they lead manage more effectively through constant change? Because we know that that's not going to change, right? We know that there's going to continue to be things. And I think we have to call out what are the internal stressors and the external stressors and identify where we have control over over some of these stressors. And Karla, I, invite you to kind of jump in to share what you have seen. I know in our work, role ambiguity and unclear expectations is an incredibly strong driver of stress in the workplace. We hear it everything from not being onboarded correctly, not understanding what the role itself is, or the role changes over time, or people leave and those tasks or responsibilities get placed on another role, but it becomes unclear. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest offenders when it comes to, interpersonal dynamics and anxiety in teams, actually, and psych safety. So when we think about like mental health and addressing this in the workplace, like role ambiguity is creates risk, like greater risk for folks, experience more heightened mental health challenges or even mental health disorders. So when we think about role ambiguity, we actually have a model that we'll be sharing next that can help operationalize this for you. But it may not just be about just job description, right? It's norms too, or there's like the unspoken part of the role, right? So like if I'm a new team member, I have my job description, I can follow that, that's tangible, but there may have been other, sort of not official or informal norms or roles or how people work together. That clarity isn't always defined, so I think that's key. And maybe not also consistent among other teams. So what I'm experiencing when I'm working with this team is different from this team. So how do I operate, and how am I being measured, or how am I being viewed if I don't abide or conform to a certain norm, right? So I think all of that gray just adds load to the brain, right? And creates more anxiety and uncertainty.
Mhm. And shifting priorities for sure, poorly communicated change, we started talking about a little bit earlier, but we know that there's going to be a lot of pivoting when you're going through change. And priorities may get shifted. I use the example of the person who's, working day and night to be able to finish a project or get it over the finish line or get ready for the big presentation. Didn't realize that at yesterday's meeting, that that got waitlisted, that got pushed back because they weren't part of that call and no one communicated to them that all the work that they're doing is now delayed another 3 months. What have you seen, Karla, with regards to that with poorly communicated change?
I mean, a lot of it is like you said, it's not intentional. It's
Right.
there's just so much, right? So like a lot of times it's one, I think, when we're also, I think what we just had a staff meeting and this came up as far as distraction, and just every 40 seconds or so, like, I mean, our brain can't even focus for that long today because there's just so much stimulation. So making sure that when we're shifting priorities and communicating to the team, like that needs to either be noted, like our memory, like people are also forgetting, like when we're heightened stress, our hippocampus, a part of our brain, actually shrinks and shrivels. So think of a grape going into a raisin, and that's our like short-term memory. So that's actually what I've personally experienced a shift, a decline in my ability to retain memory and short-term memory. So when you think about poorly communicated change, I mean, someone could have the best intentions to be an effective communicator.
Mhm.
5 minutes later, they're in a meeting and they've completely forgotten. So I think making sure we're noting things down, operationalizing this is really key. But yeah, very human too. So I think I just want to give people space for grace that if you have exhibited this behavior, it could also be an opportunity to check in with your own well-being too, and how you may have been you're putting that on the back.
Yeah, and it's refreshing, first of all, to hear you say that because now I'm feeling a little bit better about me not remembering everything that I used to be able to. But it also strikes me in this world of hybrid, remote, in-person work, you're oftentimes having to communicate to different groups of people at different times. And that can add to this too, where I thought that I had communicated to Karla something, but Karla really wasn't on that call. And maybe I didn't see her because we didn't have, not everybody, I could see everybody. I couldn't see everybody on the call. I also think here it's really important, and we'll talk about this. If you are delegating communication to other groups of people, delegating to directors or managers, be very clear on what you're expected to communicate and when they're expected to communicate. Because sometimes that's where it falls down. And again, it's not necessarily intentional. It's, they left the meeting with the intent to communicate to the next level of the organization. And then something happened and they got pulled back into another priority and the communication didn't happen. Digital overload. Oh my goodness, constant connectivity. What do you see here, Karla?
I mean, exactly what I mentioned earlier, right? The attention span of folks. This does require self-discipline, but here's the thing, and this is what the challenge is. The constant connectivity is also, helps to activate dopamine in our brain because it's sort of that instant gratification of staying connected. It kind of gets us that dopamine hit. And so it's wired like being like seeing the inbox or hearing the ding, right? Or like checking our to-do list, like all of that like stimulation actually does feel good at some level, and feeling that connection. So it's self-discipline, I would say, this is the one where it really requires having to just shut off, like if you're going to work on a project that requires full attention, like disconnect from the Wi-Fi, right? Or having some guardrails in place is really, really important for this one. But yeah, we live in a digital world. One thing I wanted to mention with the shifting priorities or just making sure folks are communicated and up to date. I've been in more and more meetings, external, where organizations are using AI note taker
Mhm.
as a feature like that you integrate into Teams or Zoom, and it reports out like in a very accurate way, right? It's wonderful as far as like what was discussed, what's the next step, and that could be best practice to also save somewhere, or so folks that may not have been able to attend are also have a way to be updated, right? So if I was sick or I couldn't make it last minute because I had a conflict, at least I can go in and say, okay, like I'm up to speed with what happened. So there's no surprises. So just another plug, just as we live in a very digital tech, space, and AI, should really be embraced for these types of efficiencies.
I would also add to that, think about everybody receives information differently. So you have to have you have to build out a change management strategy, right? You should just have a good, solid change management strategy. How is it going to be communicated organizationally, departmentally, individually, and then the different ways that it's communicated. So I think that's a great idea to use the AI note taker if it's allowed in your organization, and that it should be posted somewhere. And think about how you can use your monthly, weekly check-ins with staff members. And how can you use your department meetings to communicate? So it's got to come in multiple forms to be able to ensure you're hitting everybody. Um, Lastly, is this lack of autonomy and control over work. I know that this stresses people out.
Mhm.
What do you see there?
Yep, yep. Well, so here's the thing, right? Different leadership styles too, and they're, as I think about the true colors, right? Like when some folks get stressed, and one of their stress behaviors are more like detailed, microman, tighter grip, right? And so we think about lack of autonomy. If you're a leader in an organization, just think about what are your stress behaviors when you are stressed. Do you tend to double down and, tighten the ability for folks to maybe have more autonomy and control over their work, but also, are you experiencing that? And I think this is important to normalize it with stress. People want control. And that can often come down to feeling less in control because when there's overwhelm, right, we want to be in the know. But this is where psychological safety comes into off, and I'm showing that because of my behaviors and actions are supporting that, and the managers is modeling that I trust you, that can keep that autonomy in continuum. But also the communication channels need to be efficient as well, right? Because it's easy to miss information when you're given that autonomy but not in the loop. So it's a balance.
And I just want to add something here because the control over work, what I have seen, and Carla, perhaps you have as well, that during times of change where someone is unclear or uncertain about what the outcome is going to be, to be able to provide some sort of clarity around the process of change. So even though I don't know what the outcome is really going to be, or I'm not comfortable with the outcome, at least I know that we're going to meet weekly and I'm going to ask for your input and feedback on how things are going, what's working, what's not working with that change. Gives a degree of control back to the individual who is experiencing change or maybe struggling with the ambiguity around the bigger picture. Have you seen that be effective?
Yeah, so to your point, right? I think autonomy doesn't mean let's check in once a month or every 2 months. In fact, one of the strategies to help with living in a VUCA environment is there are more touch points, but not long touch points, right? So just check-ins, just to make sure like we're aligned. So whether that's a live or experience or a dashboard even of like ways that we can make sure that we're on the same page, but that human touch point too of check-ins, right? So I think that when people feel that I'm not alone in an island, because I think sometimes it can feel a little lonely when we give folks too much autonomy and not enough clarity about what work am I focusing on. So those touch points need to also be centered on like being clear of what is the priority right now that we need to focus on, especially when there's a ton, right, on as far as the list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd also just it made me think of one more thing. The so many of our employers have people working remotely. Not everybody is wired to work remotely, and that in and of itself can be a stressor. So really, to Carla's point, having those touch points with both your staff that you physically see in the office, but making sure you're intentional about reaching out to those that you may not see as often to check in on them, have the camera on, see how they're feeling, read kind of what they're not saying, and get a sense of how they're responding to change. I want to talk about these external stressors. So even though we may not have control over these, we have to recognize that people are experiencing this externally, possibly internally, but externally. And we have to acknowledge that that is having an impact, could be having an impact on their levels of stress, societal disruptions, and this cultural misalignment. I think about Carla and I had a lot of conversation around this between new initiatives and established norms. I think about currently, right? So we have some changes going on with the current administration with regards to what organizations can and should not be doing in order to receive funding and things like this. This may have caused organizations to have to pivot and realign, and it may be causing some disruption within organizations to say, well, wait a minute, this is what we do. I don't understand why we're doing it this way. Can you speak a little bit to that, Carla, and how that is impacting stress levels?
Of course. Yeah. So, especially for our mission-based organizations that we get to work with, and, don't necessarily only a nonprofit would experience this, and I'm sure there are other examples. An employee is often led to the mission work because of, the greater, value and sort of what the organization stands for. So what I've been seeing, actually, these are very real examples that I've been noticing just running focus groups for staff and working with leaders, in the last several months. It's this disconnect, a value conflict of like, wait, what we stand for is this. Now we can't do this. And that's a core part of our mission. And we just got to rebrand some things we're doing. And so it's not sitting well with at least some of the organization and the staff that I've been connecting with, but they understand that the bigger mission is to stay solvent and exist. Right. And so there's like a bit of a challenge, right? Because they want to buy in and they get the bigger reason, but it's being able to like reconcile that feeling of disconnect and conflict.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that in education. We're seeing
Yeah.
it in really across the board, even in our for-profit organizations. But to your point, focusing in on your values and your mission, which
Right.
have not changed. It's just helping people reconcile how you're going to get there and how you're going to be doing it when things externally have changed.
Right.
So I loved when we were speaking earlier and you introduced this grippy as a way to as a strategy really to help address this.
Yeah, so for any folks, OD, organizational development folks on here, this might be a familiar model. This was introduced in the 1970s by Dr. Beckerd. He's one of the pioneers in the OD field. And he developed this as a practical framework to diagnose and improve team effectiveness, team dynamics, right? Especially in complex or cross-functional team environments. So we were thinking about ways that, what's a simple model to assess and also as an intervention, be able to improve team effectiveness and reduce team anxiety. Immediately thought of Grippy and repurposing it to, fit this kind of mental health and well-being context that we're discussing today. What's wonderful about Grippy is that it helps teams function effectively by aligning on four foundational components. So the theory here is that when they're misaligned, they can contribute to stress, anxiety, and conflict. So you see here it's goals, roles, processes, and interpersonal relationships. So let's start with goals, right? This is important. Like when team goals are unclear or constantly shifting, of course they are, right? Because we're in a VUCA world, it can create confusion and performance anxiety, right? So mental health is supported when team members understand what success looks like and how their work aligns and contributes to that. So how am I, it's like the GPS coordinates that I mentioned, right? Is that clear? And so sometimes that means we have to re-clarify our goals during this time, involve employees in that as well, or just get a pulse on, are we all even clear on what our objectives are? So goals could be the larger organizational goal, but if you're managing a team, your goal and purpose might be different, right? It might look different. So even developing your own team purpose statement or goals of like, why do you exist? Who are your stakeholders as a team? What does success look like for us? So that's, I think really key as far as the Grippy and, making sure that that's intact and clear.
Mhm.
Anything to add there, Allison?
No, I just think it's when I look at this, I think about some of the work we're doing with teams, to your point. And when we get in there and we start working through the goals and goals are so important, but the roles, I find that there's a bit of a disconnect at time in how leaders understand role definition from the outside to how the actual individuals on the team understand their roles. And I think it's a really important exercise to ask people on a team, what is your role? What are you responsible for? And to just objectively listen to everybody or have them listen to each other and identify where there's alignment and where there's misalignment so that you can create or reduce some of that ambiguity that Karla's speaking about. Don't
Mhm.
take it for granted that because you believe that the roles are clearly defined on a team, that the team understands how the roles. And the reason I say that is Karla mentioned earlier, there's it's what the roles are, what the process is, but then there's also how individuals on that team actually live in those processes or the workarounds that they have found to get around certain individuals or certain barriers that may not be clear to leaders. So I think getting in there and doing this, using this as a diagnostic to determine where there are opportunities to better align is really important.
Yeah, and we've covered roles already earlier in this webinar, and I just want to reiterate, like the clarity is really key. Ambiguity in roles can lead to overworking, frustration, wasted energy and time, right? Focusing on what's not important and what matters. Well, I was just in a meeting yesterday, and it was interesting. It was a leadership team meeting, and it was actually about roles. We were talking about psych safety, and I was facilitating this engagement, and one of the members of the team had just shared like there's a lot of stress that's happening in the organization, but shared like what's the unseen stressors that he's carrying, because one of my prompts was what's the invisible load that you carry that others may not see. And so that even that prompt of asking yourself and your team, what's the invisible load that you're carrying right now that maybe we don't understand or we're not seeing? And it's a way to rehumanize one, the
Mhm.
connection for each other and empathy. And it was probably the most wonderful part of the most impactful part of the meeting, because you could just feel the shift in the dynamic in the team once, this person had the courage to start and share the load that he was carrying, and how that trickled into someone else sharing, I had no clue. Wow. Like, and then someone else had, it just created this level of connection that they needed, especially now more than ever. So clarity is, like Allison's point, sometimes just asking someone in the team, just share, like, what do you feel like are the top three, the most three things that you do, top three things that that can describe what you do, in a nutshell. It's not about job description. I don't need to look at your job description, but how would you communicate what you do? And is that
Mhm.
in alignment with my interpretation of what you do, right? Because the assumptions can go haywire and wild when we're in in an environment of VUCA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that gets to the processes, because the processes are the how it gets done.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's that's where I was saying, like, you could have a well-established process, but there are workarounds that happen, whether they're intentional or not. If somebody's driven to achieve a goal, they can't do it because there's a blocker on the team, they're going to work around it. They may not say anything to you. So what do you recommend around the processes?
Yeah, I think lack of clear decision making or communication processes can lead to that chronic stress and feeling of helplessness. So, like, well-defined, inclusive processes, they support fairness and predictability, right? So, I think that the fairness is key. So, you could create a process, right? But really looking at it through the lens of, is this just a generic process that I've taken out of, some literature or handbook? Or does this fit the culture of my team? Does this meet the need? Like, is this something that, is inclusive and fair to all, right? We're going to talk about fairness in the next slide and why that's so critical. But well-defined is key. So I think this is where the assess internal, like, part where we had the previous slide of just knowing what are some of the stress offenders in the group. And if you're noticing people are not clear about how to get things done, or who needs to be involved, like, maybe that's an opportunity to double click on. Okay.
Yeah,
And
I'd also say there too, processes are no longer kind of set it and forget it, right? Obviously, there's some safety things and that are stay and remain standards, but in this world of constant change, a process that worked last week,
Mhm.
if you're not asking how is this working, are you able to do what you need to do, not asking for that feedback and tweaking it could lead to that work overload that Karla is speaking to.
Yeah. And then the last one is interpersonal relationships. So, I think we want to acknowledge here that there's an interplay of the grippy components. They're not like just standalone. So role clarity, for example, can impact interpersonal relationships. Just clarity in general, right? Lack of, like, ineffective processes can affect interpersonal relationships. So it's a lot harder to build trust with team members, especially if you're the leader of the team, when there's a lack of clarity and not enough, clarity, even just the process of how to get things done, because that creates unnecessary team stress and anxiety. And that, impacts the level of trust that someone may have, right? Even though it's not intentional, it could be the most compassionate, empathetic leader individual. But if the ecosystem that the team exists in is one of, like, stress inducing and anxiety inducing, it's a lot harder for us, our brain especially, to lean into trust and that psych safety feeling.
Yeah, and I go back to something you said earlier with communication, more frequent, shorter. Like
Mhm.
that, those check-ins, have the check-ins. They could be as quick as what's one thing that's working, what's one thing that could be better. And really listen to what that is so that you can get a pulse on you're building that relationship and you're listening for feedback that you can then in turn provide additional support or perhaps some safety. I'm not saying that every piece of feedback that you receive requires that, we take some action, but every piece of feedback should be heard and acknowledged, and considered.
Yeah. And so here's that other model that I had mentioned that, we have autonomy here, as you'll see, and we'll break this down for you. The SCARF model describes 5 social drivers that directly impact our threat and reward responses. So these are triggers, for stress, anxiety, and motivation in teams, right? So if you're noticing disengagement in teams, this is a really wonderful model to use to also assess. So it could be a diagnostic and an intervention tool. So as you'll see here, right, what feels threatened when we think about all these different components. So status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, all core human needs. And you can even just check in with yourself for a moment, like how you would relate to these terms, right? How important is status to you? And this isn't just about, status in a hierarchy, way, right? It's just status of feeling valuable, feeling like you're viewed as someone who has value in the organization, your competence, your contribution. Certainty is going back to the VUCA, right? It's lacking in the VUCA, context, but it's that predictability, and we know that this is difficult in how our world is being experienced right now. Uh, Autonomy. So we mentioned, like, how much do you give folks as far as autonomy? I mean, it is a core human need for all of us, right? Some might need it more, right? Some might need full independence, where others might actually value working with others in small groups and teams. But I don't know if I've never connected with anyone who's actually likes to be micromanaged, or, have too much structure in place that they don't have the flexibility to design the work in a way that might meet their own needs. So it's that choice, and just feeling like you even have a choice can make a difference. And then you've got relatedness, which we've touched on in interpersonal relationships, right? So same thing, feeling a sense of belonging. So there's where your psych safety comes in again. Having that feeling someone has my back if I fail in this team, if I make a mistake, or if I'm, fall short of my deliverables, that I won't be shamed in the team. I won't be ostracized from my tribe, right, per se. And then lastly, it's that fairness that I tied into when you think about processes and how we're making sure that how change is being delivered, how policies are being developed, right? That there is that sense of I'm feeling like I'm treated fairly. How even communication is being delivered. Is it consistent? And is everyone feeling like they're getting either enough airtime in a meeting, or they're getting enough attention and care or check-in time? I think that's all to be considered. And then in the bottom there, you notice we did include as well some recommendations for each of the SCARF components. But let me just pause and let Allison, I'm sure you have a lot to share as well, and maybe some thoughts on this.
Well, I think it gets to that vulnerability, right? So that when, if my value is being, if I'm questioning my value to an organization, how productive can I really be? And I think about this with a very simple example. When you change technology platforms in an organization, somebody who perhaps may not be as technologically savvy or not used to this new technology, who used to be considered the top person for the top go-to person for whatever, is now really struggling with learning the technology. Very simple example. But then they start to question their competence and their worth and their value. And I think it's making sure that you equip individuals as you're thinking about, supporting people through change, with the proper training, with the proper support, with the proper tools and resources to be able to help them develop in that particular area. I think when you look at what needs to be reinforced, those are those intrinsic needs that Karla spoke about, and to be able to support those or preserve those is supporting the person to be successful.
Mhm. Yeah, and so, just in short, that SCARF can really help leaders identify and reduce hidden threats to mental health by addressing those core, what we call social emotional needs at work.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just what's happening at work. It shows up and it gets to the core of who you are and what's important to you,
Yeah.
those human values.
So we would bring it back to psychological safety, and having being aware. How can we create more of a what could feel stable, right, in the VUCA times? There are a lot of ways that, of course, we already reiterated and reinforced earlier. Psychological safety is an ongoing process. It's not a set it and forget it type of initiative. And it's really about, making sure that when it comes to even mental health, like normalizing the fact that one in three individuals, right, today are living with a mental health challenge or disorder, right? That's what's the data showing. So we do the math, right? We think about one in every three folks that we're connecting with in the workplace have a lived condition. Now, are they feeling safe to share that? Or they feel like they can get support from the team? Are they, maybe feeling an increase in anxiety because they might feel like the job insecurity might be higher because if someone finds out that I'm struggling, how will that impact me? Those are the things in the context of mental health that we can really help, foster is, being able to normalize that this is actually a lived human experience. It's normal for people to experience more anxiety today. How can we be more supportive and empathetic about that? And it's an appropriate level of vulnerability I find to be really powerful in organizations where we can normalize like a leader saying, maybe feeling overwhelmed that moment or a lot going on in the family life and saying, maybe not a critical meeting, but hey folks, hey team, can I just have space for grace today? If we can reschedule this check-in meeting for next Monday, I just want to be the best for you and present, and I'm unable to give that to you now. That's a real example, by the way, that a leader told me that they modeled that courage to do that and how she noticed the shift in just how the team even was like more humanized and was able to lean in and share some of their own challenges. She didn't disclose, anything too personal as far as what she might be living or going through, but giving that, modeling that, I think is so critical today because otherwise we're just all pretending we're not struggling. And that's not serving anyone, right? Like,
And it's not the
yeah.
case.
Yeah, and I can guarantee Allison and I are in this field and we do this and we preach this all day. And I don't know, Allison. I mean, I have a lot more gray hairs now and my memory's going. So I don't know. I'm not immune to this, by the way. So oh boy. But yeah, I think a lot of this just reinforces what we've talked about. Communication is key, right? Making sure that we're focusing on the good too. Although it feels like everything's bad, I do want to remind everyone that there's still so much good happening. So whatever you can highlight, to boost that prime people for hope and positivity can help the psychological safety in a team because emotions are so contagious. It's like a virus in a team, right? And so if there are ways that we can counteract that and focus and remind people of good things that are happening and highlight that, that can also buffer some of the, negativity bias that we're all experiencing.
I would just like to add something to that too, under communication, because you made a really good point. It's not all bad. And in most cases, not everything is changing. So
Hmm.
sometimes people have to be reminded of what remains the same, just to ground them a bit. And it's not like, oh, today it was this and tomorrow it's this. It's not always like that. This is going to remain the same. You're still going to be reporting to such and such. We're still going to be presenting to this information on a quarterly basis. And the other thing I wanted to add here too is when you talk about communicating the why, what, and the how, I'm going to also add the who. Who is impacted? Who can you go to for questions? Because in times of change, people will have questions, and you need to make sure that they know who to go to for those questions. And people may have more questions than you may care to answer, but just know if they're asking the question, there's something that has not been resolved. So help them figure out what it is they need to be able to satisfy the answer to that question. So just to summarize, clarify goals and roles, communicate with transparency and predictability. We can't emphasize that enough. During times of change, that's one of your greatest levers to help reducing stress. Those interpersonal contacts and connections, you sometimes they take more time, but they're worth it. They give people that safety, that psychological safety, that they know that you're there to support them. Align change demands with capacity and well-being, and remember the empowering people that Karla had spoken about with autonomy and recognition and fair practices, all in the spirit of really fostering psychological safety. Um, Karla, I haven't checked the chat. Did you want to check the chat to see if there's any
Yeah.
questions? And I'd really love to open it up to the group if there's anything that we haven't covered, or if you have any questions on what we have covered to use
Don't see
the
any
last few minutes.
questions, just some comments along the way. So thanks, folks, for engaging with us throughout. And Kylie, good point about the AI note taker. I think context matters. So for situations that maybe folks don't feel comfortable or it's a confidential meeting, we definitely don't want to record those ones.
Exactly, exactly. Well, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for taking time on this. If you're in this area, a rainy Wednesday morning, to hear some thoughts around navigating change. Should you have any questions or want additional information, please don't hesitate to reach out to Karla or myself. Again, we will be sending a link to the recording of this out for everyone. So please share it with someone that you think may benefit or enjoy the information we shared today. Thank you, Karla, for joining us once again, and thank you, everybody, for listening in today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Enjoy the rest of your week.